What can data about truck driver job applications tell us about industry trends and the economy, and what fleets should do or not do when it comes to keeping drivers happy and keeping them? Welcome to HDT's Leadership Insights. I'm Deborah Lockridge with Heavy Duty Trucking, and today we are exploring how truck driver job application trends can give motor carriers insights that can help them with driver recruiting and retention. This Leadership Insights episode is produced in partnership with and sponsored by Tenstreet, and with me today is Tim Crawford, who co-founded the company in 2006 and today is CEO. Tim, I think I first talked to you in 2007 for a story on recruiting in the internet age. I'll date myself there. So it's great to talk to you for this episode of HDT Leadership Insights.
Hey, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it and enjoyed that sort of walk through memory lane. Since that interview happened about 12 months ago, I'm not quite sure where the other couple went.
So briefly describe what Tenstreet does.
Yeah, what we try to do is we try to connect carriers and drivers across the footprint, right? Across, from pre-recruitment advertising through the recruitment and application process, onboarding, safety, and throughout. So every place those two groups come together, we try to create tools to make those interactions more effective.
And so that ends up giving you a lot of data, right, about drivers applying for jobs and interesting trends there. So, and in fact, we were talking about these changes can track with sort of a state of the industry and the economy. So what are some of the things you're seeing there?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's something that we find really, really interesting. If you think about drivers looking for a job, a single job application is just that, one person looking for a job. We saw over the last 12 months, circa 3 million drivers apply across the platform. And so when we get the privilege of looking at that much data, we think it's an X-ray of the whole industry of what's really going on. Because drivers every day are voting with their feet, deciding where they want to take their careers next. And the question that we always come up with is, well, are drivers moving towards something? Better opportunity, sign-on bonus, better pay per mile, or are they moving away from something? Not enough miles, not enough home time, those sorts of things. And what can that tell us about the driver's view of the state of the industry, if you will? And what we find is that we starting about this time last year, about June of 22, driver sentiment seems to have been deteriorating pretty consistently. And it plateaued or floored rather late winter, early spring, and it's kind of been bumping along and neutral kind of since then. In particular, what we look for is how long a driver stays at their current employer before they start looking for their next job. Like if you average it out, okay, how long have they been at their current employer? With the idea being that it is expensive for drivers to change jobs. We estimate it probably costs a driver about $2,000 out of pocket to move from carrier A to carrier B. They're off the road, they're not working, drivers aren't driving, they're not bringing home any income. And so they're going to do that with some care. And when times are good, they tend to stay where they are longer, is what the data tells us, right? Before they go apply. Meaning, hey, the sign-on bonuses, the incremental pay raises, there might be effective at retaining drivers. They probably only work on the margins to attract new drivers to a carrier. Because if you think about it, if you're going to give up $2,000 to make a switch, it's going to take a lot of extra cents per mile to sort of make that up, right? To sort of make that switch.
Right.
But when times get worse, which is what we've been seeing since this time last year, unfortunately, now all of a sudden, the grass on the other side of the fence doesn't have to be as green, because the grass in your own yard is starting to get a little, brown and patchy is what we think we see happening. and drivers look to be making that move more soon, more quickly. And so the driver sentiment from that perspective, really climbed throughout COVID, right? Consistent with all the things we saw around freight prices and freight volumes and those sorts of things, and it's definitely decayed since then, right? And so who knows what we'll see in the next couple of quarters ahead, but for right now, I think that the drivers and it's consistent with what we're hearing from our carrier clients, very much stuck in neutral.
So when you say, the grass is not as green where they are right now, like fewer miles, they're not earning as much money. That's essentially what's happening as we've seen that slow down in freight.
Right. And the interesting thing from our perspective is we can look at that data in kind of real time and say, okay, what were drivers thinking today? What were they thinking this week? Because it is a moment in time decision for that driver to decide to go, how seriously to get into the market. And the average driver gets in the market, at least dips their toe in the water 3 times a year, is what we see. And when they are serious, right, is when we're starting to take the reading around what we call most recent tenure. Sort of the driver sentiment is, okay, they didn't just dip their toe in the water, they're doing full applications, they're really engaging the process, they're really thinking about making a move. And that's what we've been seeing lately.
So what does this kind of trend pattern lead you to give some advice perhaps to motor carriers on recruiting and retention? What can they do to keep those drivers that are maybe looking at where the grass is not as brown, or to attract new ones?
I think it's a great question. And I think the first thing is knowing that drivers, even in a down market, have a great ability to go move on to another carrier if they don't feel confident in the carrier they're at the moment, right? We urge clients to communicate as clearly as possible with their drivers what that carrier's prospects are. You hope that a lack of information isn't going to create a vacuum. The drivers are going to say, oh, they haven't told me how things are going. I'm not happy with my miles this week. Now I'm going to go make that next job application. So I think transparency and respect to that current driver group is really, really important. And I think on the recruiting side, I think it's one of those situations where being as clear as possible as to what that carrier is offering. Hey, these are the freight lanes we're in. These are the types of clients we brought on. This is the average number of miles our drivers are getting. Is going to be important, because that's why we think drivers are in the markets, because they're not seeing those things. And I think the more transparent you can get there, the better off you'll be.
So do the numbers differ as to whether you're talking about newer drivers or drivers that have years of industry experience? I mean, most carriers would like to hire drivers with experience. And how do those trends change when you look at that?
I think the biggest thing that changes, the level of activity in terms of how active drivers are in the market, is relatively flat, inexperienced versus experienced. The difference is one of how many carriers a driver has connected with over their career. If you're a new driver, just have your CDL, 6 months of experience, you've probably talked to 4 or 5 carriers. If you're an experienced driver that's been dipping your toe in the water 3 times a year, two times a year over a 10-year career or 12-year career, there are, on average, experienced drivers have connections to somewhere between 20 and 25 carriers. Well, the average experienced driver gets an inbound marketing message from a carrier about once every 3 or 4 days. I mean, there's a lot of outbound messaging going on. And so I think the difference between experienced and inexperienced is primarily one of it's easier to stand out with inexperienced drivers just because there's not as many inbound messages to that driver.
Right.
Experienced drivers are really, really popular. They get lots and lots of messages that we can see.
When we were talking before the interview, you mentioned that drivers seem to reapply to the same company multiple times over their career. What does that mean for how trucking companies should look at their recruiting process?
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you think about it, if you do the math and you say, well, wait, if a driver gets in the market 3 or 4 times a year and they've been in the market 10 years, shouldn't they be connected to 30 or 40 carriers, not 20? And the reason is that it's closer to 20 or 25 is because drivers tend to go back, right? They have a relationship. They know something about that carrier. It just makes sense. They don't want to start over, every time, right? And so because so many drivers reapply, right? They've got some familiarity with that carrier. They want to explore that more. What we urge people to do is not just look at their hiring process from a pure efficiency of how do I reduce the time to hire people, which is important, but also think about what those touch points look like in the preponderance of the cases. Most of the people that apply aren't going to get hired on that carrier this hiring cycle, right?
Right.
And make sure that it's a friendly process to maximize your chances of reapplies, right? If that driver's applied, the driver's put you in their selection set. You're in a pretty elite group. Hey, you're one of 10 or 15 carriers that the driver's going to think about driving for in the future. Don't lose that chance by having a process that doesn't ever close the loop with the driver, doesn't say, hey, look, we don't have a spot for you now. We'd love to talk to you in 6 months, right? And be respectful and talk about those things. The reapply rate is in our world, we'd call it a feature, not a bug, right? Here's drivers that are going to be available that know something about your company. Build on that from a process design perspective.
And so what if they know about your company was an unpleasant experience trying to get hired, that might strike you off that list of carriers they're going to try to go back to.
Yeah, you hit it exactly right.
All right. Well, Tim, I think that's about all the time we've got today. Thank you so much for sharing these driver recruiting and retention insights from Tenstreet's data.
No, it's been really fun and absolutely my pleasure.
Thanks to our audience for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe to HGT Talks Trucking on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, where you'll also find other episodes of Leadership Insights.